Some curses are born not of steel, but of the secrets men bury in silence. Tonight's tale begins with a veiled visitor to Baker Street, carrying an ominous parcel said to hold the black revolver, a weapon whispered to bring ruin to all who touched it. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now, step into the shadows with me, and let us see how Holmes unravels the truth behind legend and vengeance. It was during one of those rare intervals of calm in our strange partnership, when no telegram summoned us and no desperate visitor crossed our threshold, that I found my friend in a state of restless idleness. The newspapers offered little to stir his interest, and I had begun to think that even crime had taken leave of London. Holmes, however, could never be content with stillness. His long limbs sprawled across the sofa, yet his fingers tapped in ceaseless rhythm, and his grey eyes betrayed a mind hunting for occupation. I confess I felt some relief in the quiet, for the last affair had drained me. But with Holmes, such silences invariably presaged some new adventure waiting just beyond the door. It was to my surprise, then, that Holmes had filled our table with a curious litter of ballistics charts, army dispatches, and volumes on firearms manufacture. With his pipe clenched firmly, he bent over these documents as if the fate of nations depended upon them. I had known him to bury himself in the habits of bees, the chemistry of tobacco ash, and even medieval monographs, yet this sudden passion for firearms seemed stranger still. He muttered from time to time, comparing calibers with the relish of a scholar confronted by a new dialect. My musings were interrupted by a sharp, insistent rapping at the street door. Holmes straightened in an instant. Every trace of languor vanished from his manner. His eyes narrowed, and I recognized the transformation I had witnessed on so many occasions. The idle student replaced at once by the keenest observer in Europe. "You will admit, Watson," he remarked, "that fate has a peculiar talent for punctuality." Mrs. Hudson's tread sounded in the passage, followed by the creak of hinges as the door was thrown open to our visitor. A figure stepped hesitantly into our sitting room, so wrapped in veil and cloak that for a moment neither sex nor station could be discerned. The stranger's gloved hands clutched a parcel with a desperation bordering on fear, and every movement betrayed an anxiety to glance behind, as though some unseen pursuer might yet intrude. Holmes rose courteously, bowing with the easy grace he reserved for clients of distinction. The visitor lowered into the chair by the hearth, the folds of the cloak quivering with agitation. "Pray compose yourself," Holmes said gently. "You are in safe company here. We ask nothing save the truth, and it is best revealed without delay." It was impossible not to be drawn to the bundle the stranger carried. Though swathed in dark cloth, its rigid outline betrayed the unmistakable shape of a revolver. I caught but a fleeting glimpse when the visitor shifted uneasily, yet it was enough to send a curious thrill through me. That this weapon should be brought into our rooms in such secrecy spoke of some drama behind the veil. Holmes's gaze flicked to the parcel with an intensity that suggested he had already divined more than I could. For my part, I felt both alarmed and compelled in equal measure. Holmes leaned forward, steepling his fingers with that familiar air of anticipation. "A revolver wrapped in mourning," he murmured, half to himself. His keen eyes never left the parcel, though his voice remained calm. "This promises, Watson, to be something rather more instructive than the naval pension frauds." He permitted himself a thin smile. The stranger shifted nervously, clearly torn between concealment and confession. I marvelled, as I so often did, at Holmes's uncanny instinct. Where I perceived only a frightened visitor with a weapon, he already scented the trail of some elaborate design that would soon demand all his powers. Our visitor at last removed his veil, revealing a face that had clearly weathered harsher climates than England's fogs. Colonel Ashcroft, for such he introduced himself, possessed that upright carriage which no years of retirement could efface from a military man. His moustache bristled like a sabre's edge, his eyes darting constantly toward the window, as though he feared ambush even in Baker Street. The hand which clutched the parcel bore the ridged scars of some old wound, and the rigidity of his movements betrayed lingering stiffness of limb. Yet it was not merely bodily injury that had marked him. There was an unease, a haunted watchfulness, as though memories of battle had followed him into every drawing room. Even before he spoke, Holmes had taken in the entire catalogue of the man's habits, injuries, and fears, while I struggled to grasp even his opening words. Colonel Ashcroft's first words were uttered in a low, hurried tone. "Gentlemen, I have come here because I am followed," he declared, casting another glance at the curtained window. "Whether in the busy streets of London or upon the quieter squares, I sense a presence dogging my steps. I cannot prove it, but I know it to be real." His voice, though firm, carried that note of suppressed dread one associates not with soldiers facing bullets, but with men confronted by the unseen. Holmes inclined his head with the faintest of smiles, as though the statement merely confirmed some prior suspicion. For myself, I felt the atmosphere grow heavier, for if a man of iron nerve such as this trembled before an invisible pursuer, then the danger must be formidable indeed. From within his cloak, the colonel drew several envelopes, their creases well worn by anxious handling. He laid them upon Holmes's table with a gesture of distaste. "These, sir, have arrived one by one these past weeks," he explained. Holmes broke the seal of the uppermost with practiced care and spread the page flat against the lamplight. The handwriting was bold, almost military in its severity, and each letter bore the same grim refrain. "The Black Revolver returns to claim its own." Another warned, "You cannot escape the curse." The words, though sparse, carried a menace far greater than any elaborate threat. I could see Ashcroft's fingers twitch as Holmes perused them, but Holmes himself betrayed no more agitation than if he were reading an opera programme. "Curious," he murmured. "The hand disguises itself, yet the rhythm is habitual. A man may mask his words, Colonel, but rarely his strokes." Pressed by Holmes's silence, Ashcroft began to speak of the revolver itself. "It was a custom-forged piece," he said, "blackened steel, unlike any other in the regiment. It passed from hand to hand during the Indian Mutiny, and with each new owner came tragedy. Lieutenant Morley was shot in an ambush the very week it fell to him. Captain Dyer succumbed in a duel not of his own seeking. Major Wilkes, well, he never returned from the jungle patrol in which he carried it. In every case, sir, the Black Revolver spelled ruin. Superstition clung to it until men swore to touch it no more. Yet it vanished after the campaign, and all believed it lost. Now, after more than 20 years, these letters proclaim its return." The colonel's voice trembled despite his stern aspect. I confess the recital sent a chill through me. The relic seemed less a weapon than a phantom carried from the smoke of battlefields. For a moment, the room was hushed, the weight of the tale pressing upon us. I confess my imagination dwelt upon that sinister object, steeped in blood and rumour, and I half believed some evil influence truly clung to it. Holmes, however, broke the spell with a dry chuckle. "Come, Watson, you of all men should know better than to yield to such nursery tales. A curse indeed. Men die of bullets, blades, and treachery, not of baleful whispers." The colonel shifted uneasily. "Yet, sir, what other explanation?" he pressed. Holmes's thin fingers drummed the table. "Explanations, Colonel, are plentiful. The trick lies in finding the correct one. And I will wager that the shadow following you bears more substance than any phantom revolver." With that, he leaned back, his eyes glittering, as if waiting for his client to unravel further truths unbidden. Ashcroft sighed heavily, the soldier's facade giving way at last. "You must pardon me, gentlemen," he said, "but I cannot disguise my alarm. I have faced cannon fire with steadier nerves than I face these letters. Were it only myself in peril, I might endure it, but I suspect others know the tale and would use it against me. My honour is tarnished by even the mention of the revolver." He gripped his knees, his knuckles whitening. "I fear that the superstition is but a mask, and that some enemy employs it with deliberate malice." His admission lent a new gravity to the matter. I could not help but feel sympathy, For here was a man trained to face open foes, yet trembling before whispers and unseen watchers. Holmes had watched the colonel with half-closed lids, yet I knew every twitch had been noted. At last he rose and paced before the fire. "You served in the Bengal regiment, I think," he said. The colonel started. "How?" Holmes continued imperturbably. "The scar across your temple is the mark of a tulwar, your limp the consequence of a musket ball through the thigh, and the stain upon your cuff, though discreetly brushed, betrays a fondness for port wine. Add to this the frayed edge of your gloves, suggestive of cards handled nightly, and the case is plain." Ashcroft stared in mingled indignation and awe. "You are correct in every particular," he admitted stiffly. Holmes permitted himself a thin smile. "Merely observation, my dear Colonel. You present the whole record of your life upon your person. It requires little skill to read what is so plainly written." Holmes turned back to the letters and tapped them thoughtfully. "You are right to suspect, Colonel, that superstition alone does not menace you. These threats are calculated, meant to frighten you into some admission or error. The revolver's legend serves as convenient mask, but behind it lies a human hand, skilled enough to forge menace out of myth." Ashcroft shifted in his chair. "Then you believe my life is in danger?" "I believe," Holmes replied, "that you are entangled in an unfinished chapter of your regiment's history, and that someone intends to write its conclusion at your expense. But take heart, sir. Where superstition clouds the reason of men, the clear light of fact is the best weapon, and we, Watson, shall soon enough see by that light." His words left me with a thrill of mingled dread and anticipation. Holmes wasted no time in proposing our next move. "The War Office, Watson. Paper trails may be dusty, but they are less inclined to perjure themselves than men." Thus it was that we spent an afternoon among the grey volumes of regimental returns and casualty reports. The clerks, accustomed to Holmes's brusque demands, produced files that had lain untouched for decades. Among them, we found brief references to Colonel Ashcroft's service, commendations for bravery, reports of skirmishes, and, buried in a faded ledger, a curious note that a revolver had gone missing during the mutiny and had never been recovered. To my mind, it was a trivial detail, but Holmes's lips tightened as he copied the entry with swift precision. "When a weapon vanishes in the smoke of war and reappears in threats 20 years later, Watson," he remarked, "the smoke is not yet cleared." Holmes's inquiries next led us to a gentleman of singular tastes, Mr. Pembroke, whose chambers in Bloomsbury resembled an arsenal rather than a drawing-room. Pistols of every make and century adorned the walls, each polished with loving care. The man greeted Holmes with the effusion of one expert recognizing another, though Holmes, with typical detachment, merely cast a cool glance about. At mention of the black revolver, Pembroke's enthusiasm sharpened. "Ah, the legend of the Bengal piece. Yes, yes, I have heard it whispered among collectors. A revolver forged of darkened steel, its grip said to bear a serpent's coil. They say it carried ruin to every officer who bore it." He lowered his voice as if repeating sacrilege. "But I have never seen it with my own eyes." Holmes examined a sketch Pembroke produced. "Interesting," he murmured. "Note, Watson, the unusual curvature of the trigger guard. A design that leaves a mark even when its bearer would rather it remain hidden." From dusty records and rare sketches, we passed to living testimony, though of a less agreeable sort. Ashcroft's nephew received us in shabby lodgings, where the air smelled of stale smoke and sour wine. He was a sallow young man, whose bitterness seemed to cling to every word. "My uncle sits in his fine house while I scrape a living," he said, his lips curling. "He fancies himself a man of honour, but honour never filled my stomach. I know enough of his affairs to spoil his reputation tenfold, yet he guards his fortune as though the devil himself watched over it." When Holmes asked pointedly whether he had heard of the black revolver, the young man smirked. "Old soldier's nonsense," he sneered, though the twitch of his eye betrayed unease. "Still, if someone wished to remind the colonel of past deeds, I would not stand in their way. Our final call that day was upon Major Hatherley, once a comrade of Ashcroft's, now retired to a modest cottage outside the city. He received us with reluctant courtesy, his weathered features tightening at the mention of the colonel. Ashcroft was brave, no one will deny it, he said slowly. But there were stories best left in the dust of India. Smuggling, questionable accounts of loot, whispers of betrayal during the mutiny, things the regiment hushed up for the sake of its honour. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. The revolver was part of it, I am certain. Men feared it, yes, but others knew it carried secrets more deadly than bullets. I will say no more, gentlemen. The past is a dangerous country, and those who revisit it seldom return unscathed. Holmes regarded the Major with cool interest. Thank you, sir, he said simply. As we walked away, I saw the faint gleam in my friend's eye that told me these half-spoken admissions had fitted themselves neatly into his growing chain of deductions. In the days that followed, Holmes dispatched me on several errands across the city, though I suspected he already knew the tenor of what I should hear. At public houses, frequented by soldiers, and in taverns where veterans exchanged their tales, the Black Revolver's shadow loomed large. Some swore it had been seen in a pawnbroker's window, others that it had changed hands in a gambling den, while one fellow declared with drunken solemnity that he had heard its shot echo in the docks. Each account was vague, yet all shared the same undertone of dread, as though London itself trembled before the weapon's ghost. Returning to Baker Street, I found Holmes unmoved by my catalogue of rumours. Precisely as expected, Watson, he remarked. Superstition is the most convenient courier of fear. Someone has set these whispers adrift, and like all rumours, they float where reason rarely follows. That evening, Holmes produced a small cartridge case, tarnished and worn, which he had acquired through channels of his own. To my eyes, it was indistinguishable from the thousands fired in India or elsewhere. Holmes, however, studied it beneath his glass with a kind of reverence. Observe here, Watson, he said, indicating a faint mark scarcely visible to me. A stamp, half erased, but still sufficient. It is the work of a London gunsmith whose peculiar flourish I have noted before. I peered, but saw little. Surely this could be any mark, I protested. Holmes's smile deepened. To the uninitiated, perhaps. But see the angle of the crossbar, the unusual curvature. It is the handwriting of metal, my dear fellow. Our man did not content himself with resurrecting a legend. He armed it anew in our own city. He jotted the gunsmith's address with brisk assurance. We shall visit him on the morrow. Men may bury their past in foreign dust, but their tools betray them when they strike again. At the workshop Holmes had indicated, we encountered a dealer only too eager to display his wares. Amongst the curiosities he produced was a bullet, darkened with age, and presented as relic of the mutiny. The man extolled its rarity until Holmes, with sudden decisiveness, struck it against the counter. A fresh gleam shone where the patina had cracked. A forgery, Holmes declared. The dealer paled under Holmes's steely gaze. Someone has commissioned you to make these appear as relics, to strengthen the fable of the Black Revolver. Do not trouble to deny it. The workmanship is your own. The fellow stammered a feeble protest, but Holmes cut him short. You have sold superstition as easily as shot and powder. There is a mind behind this trick, Watson, a mind determined to weave old fears into present danger. I confess I felt a shiver, for it was no longer the curse that haunted me, but the calculating intellect reviving it. It was some nights later, as we accompanied Colonel Ashcroft along a dim thoroughfare, that I first marked the figure. Tall, cloaked, and keeping always at a measured distance, he moved with a stealth that bespoke long practice. Each time we paused, he paused also, lingering in shadow. My heart beat quicker, for here was proof that Ashcroft's fears were no mere fancy. Holmes, walking with apparent unconcern, gave the slightest nod, as though acknowledging the presence of an old acquaintance. You see him, Watson, he murmured softly. Our phantom has exchanged the realm of legend for the cobbles of London. The colonel's hand tightened on his cane, and I felt the oppression of menace in the night air. Yet Holmes alone seemed invigorated, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the hunt. "Patience," he whispered. "The net is not cast in haste. Let him circle, and soon enough he shall entangle himself." Holmes, who had listened with the patience of a hunter awaiting his quarry, turned suddenly upon Colonel Ashcroft. "You have not spoken the whole truth," he said with quiet finality. The colonel flushed, his hand tightening upon the arm of his chair. "I have told you all that is needful." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Needful to whom, Colonel? To justice, or merely to your regiment's honour?" There was a long silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock. At last the soldier sighed, his shoulders sagging beneath invisible weight. "Very well. The revolver did not vanish of its own accord. I myself suppressed the report of its disappearance. There was fear that its reputation would demoralize the men, and other reasons besides." Holmes inclined his head, as if this had confirmed his own deductions. "And you hoped," he added coldly, "that silence might bury the past. Yet silence, like smoke, only clings the closer to one's garments." The colonel groaned softly. "I acted for the good of the regiment." "Doubtless," Holmes replied, "but you acted also for yourself. And that, Colonel, is why your enemy presses you now with such confidence." Determined to unearth the hidden roots of the affair, Holmes insisted we visit the British Museum the following day. Among the innumerable tomes and manuscripts, he pored with tireless zeal over volumes scarcely touched in years. I, less learned in the art of deciphering obscure references, was content to watch his thin figure bent under the lamp. At length he gave a sharp exclamation and drew forth a brittle fragment, pressed between two leaves of a forgotten journal. "Behold, Watson, the gods of chance smile upon us." I leaned closer and read a faded entry written by a junior officer of the Bengal regiment. It spoke obliquely of a certain weapon, described as the black pistol, which had become the silent witness of a quarrel among officers, a quarrel so grave that mention of it was forbidden under threat of censure. The passage was tantalizingly brief, yet Holmes's expression betrayed the significance he perceived. "It is not merely a weapon, Watson," he whispered. "It is a record, an indictment of treachery. Whoever controls it holds the power to unmask the past." I felt a chill, as though the dim museum air carried with it the breath of those long-dead men whose honour, or dishonour, still haunted London's streets. Holmes wasted no time in drawing his conclusions from the meagre lines of that diary. "Consider, Watson," he said as we walked back to Baker Street. "Why should mention of a common weapon inspire threats of silence? Clearly because it had borne witness to some act which, if revealed, would dishonour not one man but a regiment entire. The mutiny was fertile soil for betrayal, loyalties torn, fortunes made and lost in a single night. I would venture that the black revolver was present at such a moment, a duel perhaps, or the silencing of an inconvenient tongue. I remarked that the evidence seemed scant indeed for such bold conjecture." Holmes smiled thinly. "Scant, yes, but in the realm of deduction, a single true note may reveal the melody of the whole composition. You heard Hatherley speak of smuggling and whispered treason. Ashcroft's silence confirms it. The revolver is no curse, Watson, but a ledger of guilt, and it is being wielded now as weapon more potent than shot or steel." His words deepened my unease, for I saw plainly that the matter touched upon crimes far darker than superstition could contrive. It was late the next evening when Holmes astonished me with yet another revelation. "Our cloaked watcher," he said, "is no common agent. He is none other than Captain Redfield." I stared at him in disbelief. "But Redfield perished during the mutiny. It is written in the records." Holmes's smile was faint and cold. "Written, yes, but records are penned by men, and men err, or deceive." I have traced references in shipping logs, fragments of correspondence, even a medical report of a certain wounded officer treated under another name. Piece them together, and Redfield emerges like a ghost refusing his grave. My mind reeled at the thought of a man long dead walking London's streets. Then he seeks revenge upon Ashcroft, I asked. Unquestionably, Holmes replied. He alone would know the revolver's true history. To the world he is a phantom. To Ashcroft he is Nemesis. The name stirred memory, for I recalled hearing rumours of Redfield's brilliance, his daring in battle, and his sudden mysterious death. That he lived still, hiding under an assumed identity, seemed incredible, and yet Holmes set it forth with such quiet certainty that I could not doubt him. We must watch, Watson, he concluded, for ghosts have an inconvenient habit of bringing the past with them. Throughout these revelations my own curiosity burned ever hotter, yet Holmes offered me nothing beyond the briefest hints. He would sit in his chair with the half-smile of a chess-master whose pieces already lay arranged for checkmate, while I paced restlessly about the room. Surely, I protested one evening, you cannot expect me to follow blindly when matters of life and death hang in the balance. Holmes' eyes twinkled. My dear Watson, your loyalty is proof against all shadows. But knowledge, that is a burden best carried by one until the moment is ripe for two. His words, though kindly uttered, vexed me sorely. Then you admit you hold back facts, I pressed. I admit, he replied, that truth, like certain poisons, must be administered in precise measure. At times I wondered whether he found amusement in my bafflement, but there was a deeper gravity beneath his levity. He knew far more of Ashcroft's past, of Redfield's survival, and of the revolver's dark history than he chose to impart, and I sensed that only at the climax would his curtain be raised. Until then, I was condemned to the role of spectator in his private theatre of reason. It was during one of these strained evenings that Holmes at last permitted me a morsel of insight. Consider, Watson, he said, what motive drives a man thought dead to emerge from the grave after 20 years? It is not avarice, for the revolver itself bears no great monetary worth. It is not superstition, though he employs it to his purpose. No, his aim is vengeance. He paused to let the word fall heavily. Redfield believes Ashcroft guilty of some hidden crime, and he wields the revolver's legend to force exposure. I asked whether this vengeance might stop short of bloodshed. Holmes' expression grew sombre. A man who has lived as a shadow is unlikely to content himself with shadows of satisfaction. Revenge such as his demands spectacle, the humiliation of his foe, the stripping away of honor, perhaps even life itself. Ashcroft thinks himself threatened by a phantom, but in truth he faces a relentless adversary of flesh and will. And mark this well, Watson. A man who cloaks himself in myth gains power, for his enemy cannot strike what he cannot grasp. His words deepened my foreboding, for I saw how inexorably the two men were being drawn into collision, with Holmes alone steering the course. Holmes's solution, when it came, startled me by its boldness. We must draw Redfield from the shadows, he declared. He will not expose himself until convinced that the revolver is once more within Ashcroft's grasp. Therefore, we shall persuade him of precisely that. I stared at him in alarm. You mean to trick him? Naturally. Deception, when wielded in the cause of truth, is no less honourable than the camouflage of a soldier. He lost no time in setting his design in motion. Notes were dispatched by discreet agents, whispers circulated in clubs and barracks, and soon the rumour spread that Colonel Ashcroft had recovered the weapon and intended to display it before select company at his London club. Ashcroft himself was unsettled by this strategy, yet Holmes silenced his protests with icy authority. You have walked too long in fear, Colonel. Let us see how your pursuer fares when faced with light. I marvelled at Holmes's audacity. To bait so dangerous a quarry with a phantom revolver seemed the height of peril, yet his calm certainty left no room for doubt. "Watson," he said with quiet emphasis, "we do not hunt ghosts, we hunt men. And men, however elusive, leave tracks." As the appointed night drew near, I confess my nerves were sorely tested. The prospect of confronting a man who had cheated death and carried with him the secrets of a regiment weighed heavily upon me. Holmes, by contrast, displayed a composure bordering on indifference, as though we prepared not for a confrontation, but for an evening's lecture on chemistry. "You look troubled, Watson," he remarked, noting my restless pacing. "I dislike walking blind into peril," I admitted. "And you give me only fragments, never the whole picture." He smiled faintly. "Patience, my dear fellow. The end of a symphony is not played in its opening bar. Trust me that every note will find its place in time." His assurance, though it brought little clarity, offered some comfort, for I had long since learned that Holmes's silence usually signaled certainty rather than doubt. Still, as I retired for the night, I could not banish the vision of a cloaked figure slipping through London's streets, nor the thought that the morrow might bring blood as well as revelation. Holmes's methods, though often baffling to me, never failed in their effect. Within 2 days of our conversation, whispers had begun to stir among the discreet corridors of London's more exclusive establishments. Members spoke in low tones of Colonel Ashcroft's sudden recovery of the infamous black revolver, and that, at last, it would be shown within the sober walls of his military club. I myself overheard a colonel of engineers declare with incredulity that he would not miss such an exhibition for the world. Another swore he would travel from Aldershot simply to look upon the weapon that had haunted so many mess-room tales. Holmes spread these rumours with such delicacy that no one suspected the hand behind them. A chance remark to a retired major, a casual observation dropped before a regimental secretary, and soon the tale multiplied of its own accord. The more men repeated it, the less they doubted it. Ashcroft, though uneasy, submitted grimly to Holmes's arrangement. "I cannot endure this charade," he muttered once. "If Redfield seeks me, let him come openly." Holmes silenced him with a glance. "He will never come openly. He must be lured by his own vanity into striking. And when he does, Colonel, it shall be not your honour, but his freedom that lies in peril." When the appointed evening arrived, the atmosphere within the club was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The building, usually filled with quiet conversation and the clink of glasses, seemed hushed with expectation, as though the very walls had conspired to listen. Distinguished men sat in corners, speaking in whispers, their eyes straying, ever towards the long oak table at the centre of the room. Upon it rested a wooden case, draped in dark cloth, silent yet commanding. Holmes appeared utterly unmoved by the proceedings. He strolled about with languid ease, remarking on trifles to acquaintances, even pausing to compliment the steward upon the arrangement of cigars. To me, however, every creak of the floor seemed a signal, every shadow a lurking menace. I found my own nerves so strained that I started when a member merely coughed into his handkerchief. Ashcroft sat rigid beside the table, his gaze fixed straight ahead, as though by sheer will he might ignore both his tormentors and his saviour. More than once I saw perspiration bead upon his brow, and I pitied him, for even the bravest soldier might quail under such circumstances. Holmes, noting my anxious glances, merely smiled faintly. "Courage, Watson," he whispered. "The play has begun, but the curtain has not yet risen. When it does, we must be ready for the final act." At Holmes' instruction, the steward carried the veiled case forward with an air of ceremony, placing it squarely upon the central table. Several gentlemen craned their necks, whispering speculation. The colonel's lips twitched as he placed a hand upon the lid. "Gentlemen," he said hoarsely, "I am told there is much interest in a certain relic of the mutiny." His voice faltered, and Holmes intervened smoothly. "Our esteemed friend has been most reluctant," he announced. "Yet truth, like light, may be hidden only so long. Tonight, you shall look upon the object which has stirred so many rumours." He let the silence lengthen, a master of suspense in his own right. Then, With a flick of his hand, he indicated the case, though he made no move to uncover it. The members leaned forward, eyes shining with curiosity, but Holmes kept them waiting, allowing tension to mount until the very air seemed taut with expectation. "Patience, gentlemen," he said coolly. "All in good time. For now, let us enjoy the anticipation that so rare an exhibit deserves." I marvelled at his composure, for I knew well that the case contained nothing more deadly than a pair of weights. Yet to all assembled, it seemed as though the very ghost of the Indian campaign lay before them. The bait was set, and somewhere in the shadows, the hunter we sought would not be able to resist. The events that followed are burned indelibly upon my memory. The members had dispersed for the evening. The room darkened save for the dying glow of the hearth, when Holmes insisted that we remain concealed in an adjoining chamber. "He will come," he whispered, "and when he does, we must be ready." It was near midnight when a faint creak betrayed the door's movement. A tall figure glided into the room, wrapped in a dark cloak, his steps measured, his breathing hushed. He moved with the assurance of one who believed himself alone. Straight to the table he went, lifting the cloth with a tremulous eagerness that bespoke both triumph and dread. At that moment, Holmes sprang forward with the swiftness of a striking hawk. "Captain Redfield!" he cried. "The game is finished." The intruder recoiled, his face revealed by the sudden flare of Holmes's lantern, a face lined and scarred, yet unmistakably alive with fierce purpose. For one heartbeat he seemed ready to strike. Then, with a guttural curse, he lunged for the case. But Holmes was faster, seizing his arm with iron grip. I rushed forward to assist, my own pulse hammering. At last the phantom of London's streets stood before us. No legend, but a living man ensnared. The lantern light fell harshly upon the intruder's features, and I confess I started as though confronted by an apparition. The man's visage was ravaged by scars, one cheek furrowed deep as if from fire, the other marred by the cruel stroke of a blade. Yet through this ruin shone eyes of such fierce vitality that I could scarcely reconcile them with the reports of Redfield's long-acknowledged death. His cloak fell back, revealing a frame still upright and strong despite the years. "Redfield!" Ashcroft gasped, stepping forward with a pallor I had never seen upon a soldier's face. "But you were dead!" The scarred man gave a bitter laugh. "Dead? To your regiment, perhaps, to the world, certainly, but I have walked among the living in silence, biding my time." His voice was hoarse, yet carried the menace of long-hoarded wrath. Holmes's grip remained iron upon his arm, though his tone was as calm as if he were remarking on the weather. "Captain Redfield, returned from the grave, driven not by chance but by purpose. The years have altered your countenance, yet vengeance leaves its signature more plainly than age." Redfield's eyes flashed toward Ashcroft. "You shall hear the truth before I am done," he hissed. "The truth you buried with my name." I shuddered, for the dead had indeed risen, and with him a storm that threatened to engulf us all. It was then that Redfield, wrenched free from momentary silence, burst forth in words that struck like bullets. "This man you honour as Colonel Ashcroft," he cried, pointing with a trembling hand, "is no hero but a murderer. It was he who fired the black revolver in the mutiny, not at an enemy, but at his own brother officer. Lieutenant Harrington fell, not by rebel hands, but by Ashcroft's treachery." The room, already tense, seemed to gasp as one. Ashcroft staggered back, his features contorted. "A lie!" he thundered, though his voice cracked with strain. "A foul lie from a deserter." But Redfield pressed on with savage certainty. "I was there. I saw the quarrel over stolen spoils, the raised voices, the revolver lifted in rage. Ashcroft shot him down and then proclaimed the weapon lost amidst the tumult. And when I threatened to reveal the truth, he contrived my disappearance, leaving me for dead among the rebels' hands." His scarred face twisted in grim triumph. "Yet I lived, and I swore that one day the regiment and the world should know his guilt." Ashcroft sank heavily into a chair, his breath coming in gasps. I had never witnessed such a spectacle. A soldier's honour torn asunder before his peers by the one man who should have lain in his grave. My own heart pounded as the old scandal unfolded, and I turned instinctively to Holmes, whose eyes glittered like a hawk that has at last seen its quarry stoop into the snare. While the club members whispered in shock, Holmes stood motionless, his gaze fixed upon the combatants as though he had foreseen every syllable. At length he raised a hand, and Inspector Lestrade emerged from the shadows with 2 constables at his heels. "You see, Watson," Holmes remarked quietly, "there are times when one need only wind the clock and let the hands strike of their own accord." I was certain that Redfield's passion would compel him to confess the very history he sought to wield as a weapon. Lestrade stepped forward, his expression a mixture of eagerness and disapproval. "You might have warned me of the danger, Mr. Holmes. Still, I cannot deny you've laid the villain bare." "2 villains, Inspector," Holmes corrected dryly. "Redfield's tale damns him by his own lips, but Ashcroft's silence condemns him as well." I realized then that Holmes had staged every moment: the false case, the whispers, even the hour of Redfield's intrusion. He had woven his net, not for one man, but for 2, and each had stumbled into it of his own volition. I felt a thrill of admiration mingled with unease, for Holmes's foresight seemed almost inhuman, his patience that of a spider awaiting the fly. The confrontation ended as swiftly as it had begun. Redfield, his fury spent, sagged between the constable's grasp, though his eyes still blazed with the satisfaction of revelation. Ashcroft, pale and trembling, could not summon further denial. He covered his face with his hands, a soldier undone by the truth he had sought to bury. Holmes addressed them both with icy detachment. "Gentlemen, the Black Revolver has claimed many victims, but none so completely as yourselves. You, Captain Redfield, allowed vengeance to consume the years of your life until nothing remained but a scarred phantom. And you, Colonel Ashcroft, allowed ambition and fear to smother honour, until even silence betrayed you. Between you lies a weapon, but behind you lies a legacy of ruin." Lestrade ordered them taken into custody, his men leading the broken figures away. I watched in silence, reflecting that the revolver had indeed borne a curse, not of superstition, but of men's frailties. Holmes turned to me with the faintest smile. "You see, Watson, the deadliest bullets are those that never leave the barrel. Guilt and revenge travel swifter than powder." I could find no answer, for the spectacle of 2 men trapped not by myth, but by truth itself, had left me shaken to the core. It was with a profound sense of relief that I once more found myself in our familiar sitting room at Baker Street. The night's extraordinary events had left my nerves raw, and though the gaslights burned cheerfully, I could not shake the image of Redfield's scarred face, or Ashcroft's broken figure. Holmes, by contrast, reclined in his armchair as serenely as if we had attended nothing more stirring than a recital at St. James's Hall. He lit his pipe with leisurely precision, his eyes half closed in thought. "Well, Watson," he said at last, "you look as though the spectres of India themselves had followed us home." "Holmes," I exclaimed, "you cannot leave me in such darkness. I demand to know how you untangled this monstrous affair. At every turn you seemed to act with foresight while I stumbled blindly. I beg you, set out the truth plainly, if only to prove that I have not gone quite mad in following you." He smiled faintly at my agitation. "Very well, my dear fellow. You shall have the full measure, though I warn you, it is less the work of magic than of patient observation." He settled deeper into his chair, and with a cloud of smoke curling upward, began the recital of his reasoning. "The first thread, Watson," Holmes began, "was provided by those forged bullets you so obligingly examined with me. A bullet claiming to be antique, yet cracked at a touch, betrayed modern manufacture. That told me someone was deliberately reviving the revolver's legend, not merely recounting it. The second thread was the handwriting of the anonymous letters. You may recall my remark about its disguised strokes. While the author attempted to conceal his hand, the rhythm of the pen betrayed him. It was, in fact, the hand of a man accustomed to military drafting, every line measured, precise, without flourish. That pointed towards someone of Ashcroft's own world. The third, and most decisive, was the diary fragment at the museum. It hinted at a quarrel among officers, a forbidden subject, and named the black pistol as witness. Such suppression could only mean the weapon was tied to dishonourable deeds, not battlefield glory. When one sets these clues side by side, he continued, the pattern forms itself. A weapon said to be cursed, a colonel terrified yet withholding truths, forged relics spreading fear in London taverns, and a shadow trailing him with the patience of Nemesis. It was no phantom at work, Watson, but a conspiracy born of old crime and nurtured in silence. My task was merely to trace the hand that wove the web. I shook my head in wonder, for to me these fragments had seemed like scattered dust, yet in his grasp they had become a chain as solid as iron. Holmes leaned forward, tapping the bowl of his pipe against the grate. Now as to Colonel Ashcroft. From the moment he entered our rooms, I knew he carried more than fear in his breast. His tale of superstition was too rehearsed, too conveniently dramatic. I read at once that he hoped to shield himself beneath the cloak of legend. You observed, did you not, Watson, how he trembled when Redfield's name first appeared in my deductions? That tremor was not of surprise, but of recognition. Ashcroft knew his old comrade had survived, and his silence betrayed it. He had suppressed the revolver's disappearance at the time not for the regiment's honour, as he claimed, but to conceal his own crime. His present purpose was no different. By feigning terror of a curse, he disguised his greater dread, that Redfield would at last expose him. He hoped to lure Redfield into rash action, and, if fortune favoured, to silence him permanently under the cover of superstition. It was a bold stratagem, but built on sand. For once, a man invokes fear as his ally. He finds it turn swiftly to his enemy. I could not restrain a shudder. To think that Ashcroft had sat in our chambers, a murderer cloaked in soldier's honour, while I pitied him as a victim. Yet Holmes spoke with the same calm detachment as though he were describing the habits of moths. Holmes resumed his narrative with the same unhurried clarity. Redfield's survival, though dramatic, was not wholly unexpected. Men reported dead in distant campaigns often prove more resilient than the records allow. My suspicion was first aroused by a shipping log I unearthed, which listed a passenger from Calcutta bearing a false name but the correct rank and injury. Further confirmation came from a medical report describing treatment of a wounded officer in Bombay, his features disfigured, his identity carefully obscured. When combined with the disappearance of Redfield's personal effects from his regiment's stores, the picture grew plain. He had chosen to vanish, waiting until the hour of reckoning might arrive. Once in London, his presence revealed itself not through declarations, but through shadows. You yourself, Watson, were the first to note the cloaked figure that followed Ashcroft. His movements bespoke discipline, his patience, a soldier's. No common blackmailer would have risked such a pursuit. It was Redfield, returned from his living grave, determined to wield the revolver's legend as a weapon sharper than steel. Holmes paused, exhaling a thin stream of smoke. Thus the stage was set. Ashcroft feared discovery, Redfield thirsted for vengeance, and both believed themselves the hunter. Yet both were already within my net, their struggles serving only to tighten the cords. Holmes leaned back, his eyes gleaming in the lamplight. The matter reduces itself to this, Watson. Two soldiers, bound not by loyalty, but by guilt. Ashcroft, in a moment of rage or covetousness, raised the revolver against his fellow officer. Redfield, whether out of misplaced allegiance or fear for his own position, concealed the deed. Thus, both men became partners in a silence which served neither honour nor truth. For Ashcroft, the burden was masked beneath medals and reputation, yet his conscience gnawed, and he lived in dread that the phantom of Redfield might reappear. For Redfield, survival meant exile. His scars were not only of flesh, but of spirit, and with each year he nursed the thought that Ashcroft's fortunes were purchased with his own ruin. Had Redfield chosen to speak at once, justice might have been served, but by waiting, by playing ghost, he condemned himself to a lifetime of obsession. The revolver became his symbol, a relic with which to hound Ashcroft until the truth burst forth. Both men, you see, carried the same curse, not of steel, but of silence. One shot the weapon, the other buried the secret. Each believed the past could be mastered. In the end, the past mastered them both. His words fell with quiet finality, and I realized that the so-called curse had been nothing more than the long echo of guilt. For some moments I could not speak. My mind recoiled from the sordid revelation that beneath the regiment's proud banners and stirring tales of valour lay treachery and bloodshed committed by its very officers. I had always held the army as a bastion of honour, yet here was proof that even gallantry might be but a cloak for darker sins. "Holmes," I said at last, my voice heavy, "it chills me to think that men whom history records as heroes may in truth have been cowards or villains. Is there no corner of our institutions unsullied by corruption?" He regarded me with faint amusement. "My dear Watson, you persist in your illusions. The army, the law, even the church, none is immune to human frailty. Pride will embellish the annals, while truth, if inconvenient, is conveniently omitted. You should not be shocked to find shadows where men insist upon light." His tone was so matter-of-fact, so bereft of indignation, that I felt almost ashamed of my own horror. Yet I could not quell the sadness that men who once shared comradeship under fire had perished by one another's hand, and that superstition had nearly concealed the crime for all eternity. Holmes resumed with a note of dry philosophy, puffing thoughtfully at his pipe. "The revolver itself, Watson, is an object of iron and wood, incapable of will or malice. Yet men, eager to excuse their own actions, drape such tools with legend. They whisper of curses because they dare not admit to guilt. The superstitious man, when confronted by calamity, blames fate or phantoms. The rational man, though rarer, recognizes the flaws of his own kind. Consider how convenient it was for Ashcroft to speak of the revolver's curse. If his fellow officer fell, it was destiny, not murder. If Redfield vanished, it was fate, not conspiracy. And when threatening letters arrived, they were the hand of doom rather than the work of a determined survivor. Thus superstition became a screen behind which crimes could linger unchallenged. You see, Watson, weapons do not choose their masters. It is men who choose how to wield them. A sword may guard or slay, a pistol may defend or murder. The object is constant, the hand that guides it is variable. In this case, the revolver bore a curse indeed, but it was the curse of human weakness. Pride, vengeance, and silence were the true bullets, and they travelled further than powder ever could. I confess his words struck me with force, for though simple, they carried the weight of bitter truth. Holmes knocked the ashes from his pipe and gave a faint smile. "And so, my dear Watson, reason has once again prevailed over fear. The so-called Black Revolver will trouble no more. Its legend is stripped bare, its curse dissolved in the light of truth. What remains is the satisfaction of a puzzle completed, though, I grant you, not the most pleasant of human stories." I could not repress a wry laugh. "You speak as though it were a chess problem, Holmes, rather than 2 lives ruined and another extinguished." "Precisely," he returned with calm irony. "Chess or crime, the satisfaction lies in perceiving the inevitable from the apparent chaos. Men may tremble at shadows, but logic, like the dawn, dispels them." I shook my head, half amused, half humbled, for even at the close of so grim a case, Holmes could find serenity in the victory of reason. As I wrote my notes that night, I resolved once more that the world would never cease to marvel at him, nor I to wonder at the gulf between his cold brilliance and my own human heart. The tumult and revelations of the affair seemed almost unreal as we returned to Baker Street. The city outside hummed with its customary indifference, while within our sitting room, the familiar comforts awaited us. Holmes, ever impervious to fatigue, reached immediately for his violin, and soon the soft strains filled the air. He played with a languor that suggested not triumph, but a mind already wandering elsewhere. For myself, I confess I was content merely to sit by the fire, notebook on my knee, and reflect upon the extraordinary drama we had witnessed. The scarred face of Redfield and the broken dignity of Ashcroft rose vividly before me. Yet here was Holmes, serene as if the world held no darker shadows than the curling smoke from his pipe. I marvelled once more at the strange contrast between us, my spirit still shaken, his seemingly untouched. Thus ended, in our modest quarters, a case that might well have altered reputations in high places and whispered scandal across every mess in England. It was some consolation to know that the infamous revolver, cause of so much misery and fear, no longer lingered in private hands. Lestrade himself had borne it away, locked in a case at Scotland Yard, stripped of legend and reduced to the status of common evidence. I was told later that it lay catalogued with 100 other implements of crime, indistinguishable save for the notoriety which rumour had wrapped about it. I could not help but think how strange it was that an object so ordinary could cast so long a shadow. To the soldiers of Ashcroft's regiment it had been a curse, to Redfield a symbol of revenge, and to Ashcroft himself a mask for guilt. Yet to the Yard it was no more than wood and steel, soon to be forgotten amidst dust and records. Thus ended the revolver's career, a weapon of men's imagination more than of war. Holmes laid down his bow and spoke with quiet irony. "It is remarkable, Watson, how men contrive to blame inanimate things for their own misdeeds. A pistol becomes cursed, a gem accursed, a house haunted. In truth, it is but the old trick of shifting guilt from shoulders unwilling to bear it." He leaned back, the faintest smile playing upon his lips. The revolver killed no man unaided. It was Ashcroft's hand that pulled the trigger, Redfield's silence that preserved the crime, and fear that clothed the rest in mystery. Tools are innocent. It is men who are, damned by their own choices. Yet how eagerly they weave legends to absolve themselves. One might think the world a stage where superstition plays prompter, whispering excuses into the ears of guilty actors. His words, though tinged with humour, carried a weight that I could not deny. I ventured that, had Holmes not cut through the fog of myth, superstition might well have triumphed over reason in this affair. "It is sobering," I remarked, "how near we came to mistaking imagination for truth." Holmes's eyes gleamed with quiet amusement. "Superstition, my dear Watson, is merely the poetry of fear. And like most poetry, it is often misquoted, misunderstood, and pressed into service by those who find plain prose inconvenient." He resumed his violin, drawing a low, meditative chord that seemed to echo the thought. I felt at once rebuked and enlightened, for while I clung to human sentiment, Holmes could distill even terror into philosophy with a smile. We sat in companionable silence, the hour growing late, when Holmes suddenly set down his violin. "I think, Watson," he said, "that we may soon have visitors whose affairs will prove no less curious than tonight's." He gave no further explanation, only a glance that hinted at knowledge withheld. I sighed, resigned to his eternal mysteries, yet inwardly thrilled. For though weary, I knew well that where Holmes led, adventure would never be far behind. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the smoke from his pipe curling lazily toward the ceiling. "You see, Watson," he said with that dry composure of his, "it was never the revolver that bore a curse, but the men who clutched it. Fear and guilt are far heavier burdens than iron and powder. Tools do nothing but wait, yet human weakness ensures they are never idle for long." I could find no ready reply, for his words carried a weight that silence alone could answer. But let me turn the question to you. What do you think was the greatest folly? The Colonel's attempt to hide his crime, or Redfield's long pursuit of vengeance? If you enjoyed this mystery, Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes adventures. Perhaps even tell a friend who loves a good puzzle, for Holmes himself would approve of spreading a well-solved case.